Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second Summit on Bioethics, the Law, and Data Sharing for Artificial Intelligence in Radiology, or the Bold Air Summit. My name is David Larson, and I'm a professor and vice chair of education in the Department of Radiology at Stanford University, and I'm honored to serve as the co-director of this event, along with my colleagues at New York University Department of Radiology, Dr. Michael Recht, who's the chair of radiology at NYU, and Dr. Yvonne, who's the associate chair for artificial intelligence, also in the Department of Radiology at NYU. The first Bold Air Summit was held in 2019 in New York on NYU campus with the aim to initiate a dialogue around the ethical and legal challenges regarding AI in radiology. It really began with a discussion that Michael and I had at the 2018 meeting of the Society for Chairs of Academic Radiology Departments, or SCARD, as we recognize the many serious questions that need to be considered as we work to realize the promise of AI to improve the human condition while protecting the well-being of everyone that it might possibly affect. So in today's summit, we'll be convening a broad range of experts on topics including bioethics, regulation, legal considerations, industry partnerships, patient safety, data privacy, and more. And they'll share their knowledge, perspectives, and insights on these topics and on other topics. While we know that they'll raise many questions, we hope that these discussions will lay the groundwork for what is ultimately the goal of the Bold Air Summit, which is to help the field converge on constructive, well-reasoned, and practical solutions for these ethical challenges. The Bold Air Summit is presented as a partnership between NYU and Stanford, which builds on a long-running collaboration that we greatly value. We're deeply grateful to our sponsors this year, which includes Stanford University's Institute for Human-Centered AI, or HI, and Stanford Center for Artificial Intelligence in Medicine and Imaging, or the AMI Center, who helped make it possible for us to offer this summit for free of charge. I also want to thank all of our presenters and moderators, our technical team and event planners, and our colleagues at the AMI Center for their willingness to support the AMI Symposium and the Bold Air Summit on back-to-back days. I hope you were all able to attend yesterday's virtual AMI Symposium. It was outstanding, incredibly thought-provoking. And for those of you who could not attend the session live, I encourage you to watch the recording, which will be made available on the website within a couple of days. So in just a moment, I will hand it over to Ala Youssef, who will walk us through the details of today's meeting. Ala is a postdoctoral fellow here at Stanford and has done a tremendous amount of work in helping to organize today's event, which we greatly appreciate. After Ala introduces the day, she'll hand it to Dr. Michael Recht, who will kick off the first session, and I'll be back with you shortly. So once again, thank you so much for joining us for today's Bold Air Summit. I look forward to the conversation. Ala.
Thank you so much, David, for this kind introduction. We have an exciting event and agenda, including 4 main sessions. The first session is on data sharing and patient privacy. The second session is on ethics of safety, reliability, and patient protection, and the third session is on regulation. All 3 sessions include a keynote talk followed by 3 short 15-minute talk, and followed by a panel discussion. We also have a nice wrap-up by moderated by Dr. Kurt Langlotz, including Eric Topol, Nina Kotler, Tim O'Brien, and Andrea Brondi-Kitts. We hope you'll stay engaged with us. We have on the right, you will see the Slido, and you can add your questions to speakers and tag questions in the speakers, and the moderators will address them to the speakers in the panel discussion. We also hope you'll join the conversation on Twitter, and this will be an interactive conversation. You can feel free to tag at Stanford Radiology and NYU Imaging, and use the hashtag BoldAir21 for the Bold Air Conference to leave thoughts or comments or lessons learned and shared. With that, I hope you'll enjoy the conference, and I would like to welcome Dr. Michael Recht to lead the first session and introduce his own remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ala. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our first session, Data Sharing and Patient Privacy. First, I want to thank David and the entire Stanford team for their excellent work in organizing the second Bold Air Symposium, especially dealing with all of the complications caused by COVID. I am really looking forward to this session, as we will hear from 4 national leaders in imaging AI. Our first speaker is Dr. Larson, who, as you heard, is the professor of pediatric radiology and Vice Chair for Education and Clinical Operations at Stanford. David is internationally recognized as a leader in quality improvement, and in addition to his leadership role in radiology, serves as the Associate Chief Quality Officer at Stanford Healthcare. Dr. Larson is particularly interested in developing ethical frameworks that will allow the use of AI to improve patient quality experience, and the title of his talk is The Ethical Framework for Data Sharing. David.
Thank you so much, Michael. Hopefully you can hear me and can see my slides okay. Great to be right back with you. And I'm excited to present on this topic again on the ethics of using and sharing data across our institutions and outside our institutions. Just by way of background, this was something that I presented on at the first Bold Air Summit. It was in an unrefined state at that point. And based on the conversations that we had at the summit and subsequently, we were able to make modifications and refinements and come up with a framework that we're now putting forward to you right now. I have presented this at a couple of other venues, including at RSNA, so this may look familiar, but we hope that this will provide a great basis for continuing this dialogue. I would like to share a couple of disclosures and acknowledge my collaborators and co-authors of this work, Drs. Kurt Langlotz, Matt Lundgren, David Magnus, and Nigam Shah. So a common refrain that we hear in the era of artificial intelligence is that data is the new oil. And I think what is meant by that, this analogy, is that it's liquid, it's highly valuable. It powers the engine of the new economy. At least it's liquid in some sense. So in some way, it's analogous to what oil did to the economy and transformed the world in the past century. And because it's so valuable and it's highly desirable, many people understandably want access to the data. But it's also fraught with a number of sensitive questions. So in 2018, for example, and going into 2019, a number of respected institutions, both academic institutions and companies, were criticized for how they handled and shared patient data. This certainly sent a warning and may have even decreased the pace of learning from data. And we faced our own versions of these questions here at Stanford. So what we're talking about here is the use of clinical data. And clinical data are data that are acquired for clinical care. And so AI increases the potential use, secondary use of clinical data. Now, during this time, as we at NYU and many other institutions and companies around the world are working on developing these algorithms, the ethical, regulatory, and legal frameworks are still evolving. And so as we were grappling with how to manage this at our local institution and knowing that others were doing the same, we came up with this legal framework to guide us and offer this to share for others to use as well. And we have published this, and I recommend those who want to learn more to go ahead and see our paper in Radiology, which outlines what I'm sharing today. So starting with the basics of ethics in general and how this serves as a basis for our conversation. The field of ethics or moral philosophy involves systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong behavior. It establishes norms, essentially, as what is okay and what is not okay, which is really critical, especially for this topic, as a number of questions are arising that we haven't fully answered. Ethics in general is at the core of our identities as medical professionals. So we are very familiar with the ethical constructs that surround us because that was a prerequisite for us to enter into this profession. It also provides the basis for our laws, our regulations, and our policies. So as we grappled and worked to try to establish this guidance for ourselves and for others, we followed a process, a relatively generic process for establishing an ethical framework. And again, the goal is to create an ethical framework to establish practical, useful norms to guide behavior. So not something that's so abstract that it's not useful. It needed to be able to answer those thorny day-to-day questions. So our process was, first of all, articulate the question as best we could, the ethical question that we were trying to answer. then reduce that question, that problem, down to its core elements and identify who are the relevant stakeholders, who are the individuals or groups of individuals who may be affected by this question, and understand their perspectives. Now, we recognize that there's no way to understand their perspective fully because in reality, there's a spectrum of perspectives, and that's healthy and that's natural, but it's important that we understand generally their perspectives and to some extent that range of that spectrum. Then we work to choose or develop a practical framework, a practical ethical framework that best fits the situation, the problem that we're trying to solve, and then test the framework on real world questions. So come back down to that practical element and say, okay, does this framework help us answer these really difficult, challenging questions we face on a daily basis? Then we vet the framework and we make appropriate adjustments. And now we have published the framework and we offer it for consideration by the broader community. So when it comes to how to approach clinical data, historically, what we found is the mindset is about ownership. And there really are two camps. One is that the patient owns the data, and the other side is that the provider owns the data. So I'm going to give the bottom line up front here. I'm going to give our position, and then we'll talk about how we came to this conclusion. So it's our position that this is actually not the right frame to even think of this. Our position is that no one owns the data in the traditional sense, but rather when clinical data are used to provide care, the primary purpose for acquiring the data is fulfilled. The main reason why an individual underwent that CT scan or MRI was for their diagnosis, for their treatment, for their benefit. And so now we're talking about secondary considerations. And so we maintain that in terms of the potential for secondary use, clinical data should be treated as a form of public good to be used for the benefit of future patients. And as we went through this process, we actually came to this conclusion and we're preparing our publication and found late in the process that we actually were not the first ones to come up with this, but rather in 2008, there was a workshop held by the Institute of Medicine, now the National Academy of Medicine, that came up with the exact same conclusion. And that is that clinical data as a basic staple of health learning should be treated as a public good. So when we looked to see how we can frame our approach, our ethical approach, we looked at some basic ethical frameworks. And the one that perhaps we're most commonly familiar with as healthcare professionals and in a research environment is that of the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was established in 1978 as guidelines for the protection of human subjects of research. And it's based on three core elements, and that's respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And each of those has a definition and then examples, and that this is what really drives and establishes the guardrails around research on a national scale and really on a global scale. But what we found when we tried to apply this to this specific question for the use of clinical data, we found that this was actually insufficient. It did not describe and cover all the questions that we were looking to answer. And in fact, it wasn't established for this purpose. It explicitly stated that the use of data, medical data, was out of scope of the report. This was meant for research. So we kept looking. And what we came across was a 2013 Hastings Center report entitled An Ethics Framework for a Learning Healthcare System. And we thought this is exactly, or at least very close to what we're looking at. And they say right there in the title, it's a departure from traditional research ethics and clinical ethics. So we appreciate their bold statement and recognizing that there are other considerations that need to be brought into this situation. So this report outlines 7 fundamental ethical obligations that those who participate in the healthcare environment really are required or obligated to do and to uphold. There are 6 obligations that apply to researchers, clinicians, administrators, payers, and purchasers. And actually, we would add that there's one more, and that's industry. really participates in this. And so these obligations that we all have for those who manage and work in this environment are things like respect for the rights and dignity of patients, respecting clinician judgments, providing optimal care to each and every patient, avoiding imposing non-clinical risks and burdens on patients, addressing health inequities, and conducting continuous learning activities that improve the quality of clinical care and healthcare systems. And that's really what a lot of this is about. A lot of what AI is about really is ultimately that's exactly what it's for, is to improve the quality and clinical care of healthcare systems. Now, it's very interesting that there's also another obligation, the seventh obligation, that is specifically directed towards patients. And it states that patients also have an obligation in that they are expected to contribute to the common purpose of improving the quality and value of clinical care and the healthcare system. In other words, they benefit from those who came before in establishing this healthcare system that saves and improves their lives, and that we all, when we're patients, have that obligation to contributing to that common purpose of continuing to improve these healthcare systems as we go forward. So this is what we adopted as our position, that patients, researchers, clinicians, administrators, payers, and industry all have the common obligation to contribute to the common purpose of improving healthcare systems in a manner that's consistent with other ethical principles. Okay, so now let's go back to the very fundamental basics of the question that we're talking about. And that really starts with the concept of data, especially clinical data. As we looked into this and we looked for a lot of definitions, it's interesting, we struggled to find a definition that really exactly explained what are data or what is data. So I put that to you to think about. If you were asked to describe and define data, especially in terms of clinical data, how would you define that? So this is what we came up with, and that is that data is a set of recorded observations of physical properties, phenomena, or behaviors, right? So it's recorded observations, essentially. That's what we're talking about here. So that implies that there are essentially three entities associated with data in this context. First, there's the entity or the person who is observed. Second, there's the entity or person who does the observing. And third, there's the entity that maintains those recorded observations. Often that second and third category are lumped together, but not necessarily. Okay, so these have implications for some of the questions that we'll look at later on. So now let's talk about this concept of a public good. So we've stated that we think data should be treated as a public good. So what is a public good? A public good is a commodity or service that's provided without profit to all members of a society, either by the government or by a private individual or organization. So it's not provided for free necessarily, but it's provided without profit. So there are two ethical obligations that are implicitly associated with a public good. First, again, no single entity is entitled to directly profit from that public good. And second, the dissemination of the public good is to be encouraged and facilitated. So we want to get this out there and out to the public. So a common public good that we're all familiar with is that of drinking water. And if you think about it, if people were allowed to profit from drinking water, I guarantee you they could extract a lot of profit. And that's exactly why it has been declared a public good. And we say this is too valuable and too important for people's lives for people to profit off of access to water. So we make it available in a fair manner and try to make it widely available in a way that is a responsible use of the resource. So again, we hear that the concept that data is the new oil. I would say, especially from the perspective of clinical data, that may not be quite the right construct. Rather, we might think that data is the new drinking water. That may be a better analogy to think about how clinical data can and should be distributed and used to improve care and patients' lives for decades and even centuries in the future. Now let's consider this concept of data as property. Clearly, data are not a traditional form of property. Like if you go and buy a car or a house, it's not the same as having data. For one thing, data are not divided, they're not consumed. You can't physically find data in a specific place in the same way that it exists, a piece of property and land, for example. It also can be easily replicated at full fidelity, often at very low cost and massive scale. So ownership of data is really an imprecise concept. So rather than referring to data, who owns the data, we would say it's better to refer to the questions of who has the right to control the access to the data and the use of the data. And second, who has rights to share in the profit derived from the data. So those are the two questions that we're going to address. So it's also important that we recognize that the value of data and information is relative. In that exclusive access to data and to information may give a relative advantage, such as insider information. So this is why there are strict rules around what can be done with insider information and how such information is released and when it is released, and then what can be done after it's released. And so, like in the example of insider information, that advantage of exclusive access to the data or to information can be negated when everybody else also has access. So that's one way of preventing individuals or entities from unfairly capitalizing or restricting access to data is by making it more widely available. Third, it's important to recognize that data acquired for one purpose may have value for other purposes, especially when they're aggregated together. So this was the example. Actually, I shared this at the last Bold Air Summit. This was the screen cap I took of my taxi ride or my Uber ride from Newark Airport to NYU. And so this showed me the route. It helped me know how far along I was as I went on that route. But the other thing that when I do this and thousands of other people do this, then this in aggregate creates understanding that we can all benefit from. What are the traffic patterns right now? How are they shifting? How do they change over time? Right. So we all now benefit because I personally had contributed my own data, and so did thousands of others. So this has obviously important implications in the release and sharing of clinical data. Now I'd like to talk for a minute about this concept of the value of data and the difference between data, information, and knowledge. So again, especially focusing on clinical data, really what we're talking about there is an underlying phenomenon, a natural phenomenon that occurs in a patient or an individual in a certain manner that then can be observed and recorded, which becomes data. At that point, it becomes data. This natural phenomenon that occurs in an individual and is recorded becomes data, and then can be processed and interpreted, and that data then can have meaning and really become information. Then at the patient level, that information can be used to go back and establish the likely diagnosis. What is the underlying phenomenon that has caused this to be manifested in this way in this patient? So for example, we might have a situation where atrial fibrillation leads to thromboembolism, and it happens to go to the brain. And so there's a left middle cerebral artery thrombosis and infarction. So that's what's happening in the patient. Then the patient is imaged, and that becomes data, which can be formatted as an image, but really underlying this really is ones and zeros, right? It's just information. It's just data that then are interpreted. Somebody can look at this and say that this is a stroke. Basically, this is now they can use the data to go back and say this is the underlying natural phenomenon as it's manifesting in this patient, right? So there's that difference between the data and information in this case because of that processing activity that occurs. Now, if this happens for many patients and they're aggregated together, then we start to have information at a population level. And it's not just about that single patient, it's about the population. And that then can be used for research and generate knowledge and tools that can be generalizable. And these then can go back and become the basis for how we know how to translate, for example, what the information means when we have the data into what its implications are. So that is where, for example, a radiologist learns through many years of study and through research that this is a manifestation of stroke, for example. It's also how we can learn and develop our tools that we can image patients. So if we think about every step as it goes from the individual to the data, to the information, to these knowledge and tools, every step there's a value added activity. Okay, there's value added in that observation itself, but it's important to recognize that compensation is already made. That was based on the transaction that the individuals who provided that and imaged the patient were already compensated. There's also value added in the processing activity, and especially when it's an interpretation for that patient, they're already compensated, but not necessarily when it's used for other purposes. And then the research is also an added value activity. So at each step, there's value that's added. So the way that we approach this then are that that the data are the raw materials and serve as the basis for the value that can be derived, but that activities such as discovery and design and development create higher level information and knowledge where additional value was added. So this has important implications as to who is entitled to profit from these activities, for example, and because in general, in society, we generally value that and believe that those who add value should profit in some type of proportion to the value that we added, right? Okay, so let's now talk about some specific examples of how we apply what we've just talked about in the real world. So let's first of all think about the concept of third parties. We very quickly, as much as we enjoy and actually have expertise here at Stanford, especially with our computer science colleague, as much as we know we can develop these tools and have enjoyed developing these tools and those at NYU and other institutions, we recognize that we're very quickly, we're outpaced by the massive investment in enthusiasm and engagement by many, many experts outside of academics. And this is a wonderful thing, where the development of these AI tools and deployment and to have an impact on a broader scale will require things like access to capital and development resources and distribution and so forth. And all of this really depends on an expectation of financial return. This massive investment that's incurring can only happen because there's expectation that there's tremendous value creation, and that will some of that value creation will be used to finance all this effort. So this does require our industry partners to participate in this, to realize the promise of AI in this massive scale. So it raises important questions, like who will be allowed to have access to the data, especially as reflecting on some of the challenges that we saw at the beginning where institutions were criticized for how they handled the data. How do we ensure that data are used appropriately? Who should be allowed to profit from the data? So let's at least start by addressing that first question according to this framework. So who should be allowed to access the data? Well, we would say that if we think about sharing data, there's a multi-party obligation. Going back to this framework for a learning healthcare system, that we all have an obligation to improve the healthcare system. Now, we believe that this includes patients' obligation to contribute to the common purpose, as we talked about before, and that all others have the obligation to serve as responsible data stewards. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So we would maintain that it's ethical to share data if privacy is safeguarded, that the receiving organizations accept their role as data stewards, they adhere to a data use agreement, and that the receiving organization will not share that information further, especially in ways that they've not agreed to. What about the concept of wide release of data? So data can make a broad impact if those data are widely available, rather than being maintained exclusively by one or a few entities. We say the term wide release rather than public release, just because the public release may connote that there's completely unfettered distribution, but that's not the case. But rather, the sharing of the de-identified data can be done at a cost, at essentially no cost, but that is done on conditions, right? And everybody needs to agree to that. So that's what we believe. We believe in the power of wide release of data because it unleashes tremendous amount of creativity rather than keeping it more contained. But it needs to be done in an ethical way, and we believe it's ethical to do so if the recipients accept the same terms as industry partners. They identify themselves, including who is going to guarantee that the data will be managed appropriately. They agree to all terms and conditions, they agree to respond to communications, and they agree to report problems and not to try to re-identify patients. So in other words, we don't believe in just putting data out there and never seeing who is touching it, but rather have some type of relationship as that data are shared with responsible entities. The question about profit. And remember, this is for secondary use of clinical data. So the question is, should patients profit from this? There is the concept, the idea that patients, if there's value that's being derived, that patients should get part of that value. We believe that actually they don't inherently have a right to have a share of the profit, and because they've already been received the benefit of the reason for why it was performed in the first place. And also, if we started paying patients for access to the data, that could create a whole host of challenges associated with the patient-provider relationship, and conflicts of interest tend to arise very quickly. So we would say that patients are not inherently entitled to profit from sharing of the data. Now, should provider organizations profit? Excuse me, we would say no. They've already received payment for acquiring the data. And so we say that it's unethical to sell the data, especially for exclusive access. But it is okay to profit from those value-added activities that we talked about before. What about industry partners? Should they profit? And we would say, again, it's unethical to buy and sell data in this way. But again, it is okay to profit from value-added activities following ethical business practices. What about protection of privacy? This will be a topic that will be considered in great depth elsewhere. I will just let it suffice to say privacy protection is of paramount importance. There needs to be redundant mechanisms to protect privacy. We need to recognize that de-identification is not 100% reliable. All methods are inherently imperfect, and identification technology continues to advance. This is an example of a reconstructed face from an Egyptian mummy. It's amazing what the technology is able to do. So there will likely never be a time where we can say we can be sure that this data can never be used to re-identify a patient in perpetuity forever. So this then really brings up the point that all who handle the data must be data stewards. So let's talk about this concept of data stewardship. So this is a fiduciary relationship where there's a loyalty to patients to protect their interests, but also a loyalty to society to use the data for societal benefit. Obviously, it's in that order. We first protect individual patients, and then as we do so, we can use that for society. So it means that everyone who's involved basically commits to ensuring privacy protection, never seeking to re-identify data, ensuring that data are only used in their aggregate form, ensuring that data are only used for societal benefit and never for malicious reasons, and ensuring that the knowledge derived from data are accurate, representative, and statistically sound. So when we think about it, we have this sharing entity and a receiving entity. And those who work in the healthcare environment for many, many years, now for decades, have accepted upon ourselves this duty to protect information. And this was something that has always been a part of the professional ethic in medicine and has been codified with HIPAA and other regulations. But we're used to this in this environment. So what we're saying is in those relationships, in those contracts, as data are shared, it's important to establish that duty to protect, and that also there is an inherent duty to any other third parties who participate in have access to patient data or clinical data to protect in the same way that we as healthcare professionals are required to do. That duty is, we believe, is there from an ethical basis. It really should be there from a legal perspective as well. Much of the industry is not used to this yet. We believe that this needs to become further enshrined. Finally, the question about patient consent for secondary use of data. Should patients have to give consent? And so there's a principle of respect for persons where individuals have the right to make their own choices about actions that affect them. But in this construct, again, when the data are de-identified and aggregated, they're used as a public good. And really, the researchers are not looking at the individual patients per se. They're looking through the patients and the aggregated patients to understand the underlying phenomenon. So we maintain that consent is not required as long as privacy is safeguarded, the data are aggregated, there are mechanisms in place to ensure the data are used appropriately, and that patients are informed of how data may be used. And this could be in the form of a public kind of website that informs them. So in summary, data are recorded observations of physical property, phenomena, or behaviors. Once images have been used for clinical care, the primary purpose has been fulfilled. So we maintain that data should be treated as a public good and that it's unethical to buy and sell data for profit in the way we described. We maintain that patient privacy is of paramount importance and that all have an obligation to contribute to the common purpose of improving the quality and value of clinical care. And this means then that it is ethical for data to be de-identified, aggregated, and shared, but all must accept the obligations of data stewardship, everyone who is involved in this entire ecosystem. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I look forward to having further discussion in the panel.
David, that was a great talk, and thank you for that. I know there are a lot of questions that arise, and I want to remind everybody who's watching to please submit your questions to David and the rest of the panel in Slido, which you can see on the live stream. Our next speaker is Dr. Scott Reeder, who's the professor and senior vice chair of research and chief of MRI at the University of Wisconsin. Scott is a national leader in body imaging and leads a team that focuses on the technical development and translation of new imaging methods, particularly quantitative imaging biomarkers. In this role, Scott has been faced with the issue of when, why, and how to share data, which is the subject of his talk. I just want to add that we really appreciate Scott is actually away this week, and he's coming to us from, I think, Rocky Mountain National Park. So he will participate live in the panel discussion, though his talk is going to be recorded to make sure there are no transmission issues.
Hello, my name is Scott Reeder. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak in this session. In the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to be discussing why, when, and how to share data based on some of our experience at UW-Madison. I do have a few disclosures that are listed here, none of which are relevant. And so the objectives in the outline of this talk are, first of all, to spend a little bit of time talking about the importance of both academic and industrial collaborations for the mission of translating machine learning or AI technologies into widespread clinical practice. Talk a little bit about the infrastructure for data sharing, including some ethical considerations, and really overall trying to address the title of this talk, that is when, why, and how we share data. I'd like to start with this vignette, which is a weekend by the numbers. It was from my colleague, this was an email from my colleague Howard Rowley to myself and my chair, Tom Grist, who was talking about the volume of cases that he had on a recent long weekend for his neuroradiology call. And going through this, the short of it is that he read 323,000 images in about 4 days, or about 90 images per minute. That's about 1.5 images per second, and with a little bit of humor laced in there. But I think this really illustrates the point that we really need these machine learning technologies in order to really take good care of patients. A lot of folks have talked about the idea of the cockpit of the future. This is just a picture of a Boeing Dreamliner 787 with all of the amazing technologies that help the pilots to fly the plane. And just by comparison, our recent chest shift during Memorial Day weekend had about 509 cases. So we're talking about real numbers similar to that in an airliner. There are a number of broad applications of machine learning. I'm not going to go into these in these talks here, but suffice it to say there are just a plethora of potential applications, including many that are not even shown here. For example, scheduling or pre-authorization. I also think it's going to play an important role for precision health as we go from genotype towards phenotype with all of the things in between, such as proteomics, metabolomics, the microbiome, histology, medical records, even wearable sensors. And how are we going to integrate this together? Well, it's really going to take artificial intelligence algorithms to help us to do that. And I also think that these algorithms are going to help us to teach a great deal about the omics, including genomics, based on the actual phenotype that manifests with the patient. And so artificial intelligence is really going to help us unlock a lot of things. I find this personally overwhelming. And how do we, the question really is now, how do we approach this as we go to ludicrous speed, so to speak? This is a picture of my chair, Tom Grist, and I, just sort of illustrating that we spent a lot of time talking about this and trying to figure out where the heck are we going to start. And it really came down to the basics of looking at mission and strengths, and I would argue opportunities as well. The mission of the University of Wisconsin Department of Radiology is really very similar to, I think, most academic radiology departments, and that is to improve human health through innovation in imaging and image-guided therapies as part of patient care education and research. Looking at some of our strengths, we have a really special medical imaging ecosystem within South Central Wisconsin. We are a major medical center on a major land-grant university with a very strong legacy of medical physics, the oldest department in the country, very strong College of Engineering as well as local industry that includes GE, world headquarters for GE Healthcare, as well as Epic, and many other companies. And this really just sort of makes the point that we have this really strong medical imaging ecosystem. Looking at the map, here's Wisconsin, or University of Wisconsin over here in Madison, as well as the Medical College of Wisconsin. We have GE Healthcare in Waukesha, Epic in Verona, and a number of other companies that are scattered through the area, many of which we have collaborative agreements with, working on AI and machine learning projects. So what do these projects need, or what do these technologies need in order to be translated into a commercial product that's going to help patients? Well, it needs data, and a lot of it. These data have to be robust with annotation by expert radiologists in many cases. And there's also a lot of ancillary data that's very important, such as reference standards like biopsy, clinical outcomes, genetics, liquid biopsy, that kind of thing. And in order to be effective at translating these technologies into patient care, collaboration with academic medical centers has never been more important. I want to share with you the Wisconsin idea that is a concept that's been around for over a century, and it's really about bringing discoveries from the university to the citizens of the state and beyond. And I think this is a translational philosophy that most of us share. I really like to summarize it that technologies that sit on a shelf aren't helping anyone. And so I think it's really clear that helping and working with industry in order to translate these technologies to help our patients is mission central. But how are we going to do this, and how are we going to share these data in an appropriate manner? Well, there's a few things that we need to address. The first of all is that we need to remove some barriers. That includes regulatory hurdles that we need to address. We've done this largely through what we call an outcomes retrospective IRB protocol, which allows all imaging studies and procedures that have been ever performed in our department to be used for research purposes, so long as those data were acquired purely for clinical care. In addition, all the ancillary data, everything except the genomics that is related to that, can be used as well. And this facilitates classic chart reviews, but it is also proven to be invaluable. And the leading use of this protocol is to obtain images acquired for clinical care for prospective research on new software that we've developed or industry has developed or other collaborators. And this has been extremely important, for example, with training machine learning algorithms. Importantly, we also baked into the protocol that we can share data with industry. Some of the this is the approach that we take for this. So an investigator who wants to use this protocol fills out about a half-page intake form. There's some filters for QA, QI, and preparatory for research. And then we provide some quarterly reporting back to the IRB about the nature of the data that we are mining as part of this protocol. This intake form also interfaces with the IT team to assist with the searching. So we actually put our search terms right on this form. So you get the whole thing really right in one, half-page intake form in order to facilitate a project. And recently we've implemented this on RedCap to further streamline it. We also developed a process for de-identifying images for research and for translational collaborative relationships with academic and industrial partners. And this is through our medical imaging core lab, which we call Radius. And this serves as our honest broker for image anonymization. We have funding mechanisms both for internal projects as well as external projects that are well established and for the most part relatively inexpensive. Here's an example of a really neat project that was led by Alan McMillan, one of our faculty, for the development of attenuation correction for PET-MR imaging. One of the problems with PET-MR is that with PET imaging in general, is that you need an attenuation correction in order to correct for the attenuation of gamma rays as they leave the body. With PET-CT, you can use the CT scan, but we don't have that with PET-MR. And so Alan and his group used the outcomes IRB protocol with the image anonymization to obtain pairs of MR and CT data sets in order to train the neural network to generate these pseudo CT images. The crazy thing about this is that he was able to do this in under 7 weeks using this process with the outcomes protocol and the image anonymization. And that's from the conception of the project to the submission of the paper to Radiology, which was subsequently accepted. Switching gears a little bit, I want to relate this experience about this email I received. And this is, I've paraphrased this. This is from Bob Smith, all names have been changed here, at Big Tech, who says, Dr. Reeder, it was a pleasure to meet with you at RSNA this past year. I wanted to follow up with you about some potential collaborations with your department. Specifically, please find a contract with our price list to buy copies of patient imaging exams, et cetera, et cetera. And my first thing I thought was, collaboration. This is really not a collaboration. This is about selling data. It also raises the question of whose data is this anyhow? Now, technically in the United States, the images do belong to the provider or academic medical centers like us, and patients do own a copy of this. Now, I'd like to point out that this is not true in many countries. But I think the more important moral question is, are we really entitled to sell patient data for profit? And does this meet the moral sniff test? And I think when you look at the experience, for example, in this really interesting book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, about an African-American woman in Baltimore who was exploited by harvesting tissue from a cervical cancer, I think the answer is certainly no. Another ethical issue to deal with, of course, are conflict of interest. There's a number of really amazing companies that have come out of Stanford and Wisconsin and others. Here's just a couple of investigators who are doing really great work on translating important technologies into clinical care. And I would argue that this sort of conflict is actually a really good thing, because it means that things are actually happening and new technologies are actually going to get out there to help patients in a widespread kind of way. But it needs to be managed properly, because we don't want to end up on the front page of the New York Times, for example, these recent articles about Memorial Sloan Kettering Department of Pathology, or some data privacy issues at the University of Chicago. And so when we look at these collaborations, I would argue that they are mission critical, but we have to manage these relationships. There are important ethical, legal, and moral pitfalls that we have to be aware of. And so we called in a consult. And in fact, Pilar Osorio has been a really great partner working with us to engage in a cross-campus conversation. We've been developing campus and departmental pathology or policies. It's primarily focused on data use. But I have to say, this has been a really challenging issue, and it continues to be a work in progress. We haven't solved all of these issues yet. And the problem is that this is happening now. So what are we going to do? And so we developed our own internal policies within radiology. And we based this on a framework for decision-making that I borrowed from Bill Clinton, which has 3 principles that say that, first of all, does this decision take us into the future? Can we sustain it? And do we bring up others around us? And so for point number one, I would argue if you're looking at a specific collaboration with a company, you might say, well, is this collaboration mission aligned? And if it's not, then maybe we shouldn't be doing it. Can we sustain it? So are we going to be able to cover our costs, not necessarily make a profit, but just cover our costs? And does it advance imaging and human health? And so our approach to this, and this is just one approach, but this is our philosophy, and I think there's some merit to this, is that we don't sell data, period. It's just not on the table. And if it's not a collaboration of mutual interest to further our mission, we're not interested. When we do have a project that is of mutual interest, we're going to develop individual agreements with companies through the usual channels. Financial considerations are meant to cover our costs, per se. And we always do this in the proper approach with agreements that maintain transparency. And if there's any conflict of interest, we manage that through our conflict of interest committee and management plans. There's still some challenges that remain. For example, the use of data that goes beyond the agreement. And we're trying to figure out those kinks right now. But I think it's a complex issue and it's still a work in progress. Just a couple of last comments. I just sort of a little philosophizing about the idea of paying it forward. And if we have an individual patient, and here we have sort of countless future patients, the question comes up is what responsibility do patients have to help future patients? And I would argue that they have considerable responsibility. And what's more interesting, I think, is that when you actually consider the fact that the cycle of these technologies is so fast, is that when a patient actually helps us with research to develop these AI algorithms with sharing their data, it actually may be helping them one day as well. So in my opinion, past generations have participated in research. Patients have a responsibility to future generations, and we are in need of a framework that will ensure respect for patients, transparency, data security, and establish trust. And really, I think an important component of this is community engagement and empowerment, which are going to be really key. So some takeaway points. I don't have all the answers. I've just shared some of my experience and my thoughts. It's important to ask what your mission is. I would argue that sharing data is feasible and appropriate, but there are important ethical and moral considerations that are central to this whole process. And ultimately, building trust through the approach that you take and the process that you implement is really going to be key to a successful program. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. My email is at the bottom. I'd be more than happy to take questions now, or if you'd like to send me an email, you're welcome to. And I'm also happy to share our outcomes protocol with you if anyone is interested. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Scott. A great talk and certainly thought-provoking. And again, I encourage everybody to submit questions for Scott and the other panelists in Slido. And we're going to be having a panel discussion at the end of all of the talks to go over all of those questions. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, as I would tell you that one of the best decisions I have made as chair of NYU Langone Health was hiring Dr. Yvonne Louis as head of our neuroradiology section several years ago, where she did a spectacular job. And 3 years ago, I asked Yvonne to lead our AI efforts as our associate chair of artificial intelligence. As associate chair, Yvonne has been our lead on multiple AI collaborations, including our Fast MRI project with Facebook, where she was responsible for, and I listened to David, so it changed my introduction, the wide release of some of the largest fully anonymized raw data and image data sets that have ever been widely released. The title of Yvonne's talk is The Practical Problems with Data Sharing, Experience from the Field. Yvonne.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to join you today for this Bold Air conference, which has been just the brainchild of Stanford, between Stanford and NYU, and it's a real pleasure to collaborate on this project. Thank you to David Larson and his whole team for organizing. I have no relevant financial disclosures, and Scott kind of took us through all the areas where AI can have an impact on radiology. There are many different ways all along the sort of imaging life cycle, if you will. There are many opportunities, everything from segmentation tasks to low dose imaging, synthesizing information, getting actually new information, and so how do we take advantage, I guess? Scientists, machine learning scientists focus a lot on this segment of the translational pipeline, right? It probably is no more than 20% of the entire effort, though. And here today, we're here to talk about kind of all that other stuff, the rest of this 80%, and in particular with a specific mind to what is this overarching purpose and the ethical means, the guiding principles that overlie all this work. It can actually be easy to lose sight of this overarching purpose and kind of scientifically end up with what's called a mistaken objective. You actually are optimizing some mathematical equation, some loss function, but it doesn't actually serve the real need or purpose that the tool was intended for. So just to wake everyone up, I know it's super early on the West Coast. We're gonna have a little pop quiz. In the 1980s, this is an actual floor plan of a radiology department. What's at the heart of the radiology department? Is it the changing area? Is it the reading room? Some kind of break room? That would be nice. Is it the state-of-the-art single slice CT scanner? Is it a film library? Or is it something else? And it in fact is something else. It was the dark room. And, you know, it kind of boggles the mind. Wet reads, people know, were called wet reads because the developer was still wet on the films. You know, what are these things? The alternator. You can still buy these film jackets on Amazon. Is that crazy? And China marking pencils, I don't think any of our residents know what these things are. So even though it was possible to lose a film or misplace a film or have surgery, take it to the operating room and take forever to bring it back, you know, you could have some kind of privacy breach, but it simply could not be done nearly on the scale of what's possible today. So fast forward to 2021, this is my phone. You know, medical images are digitized, they're stored, they're sent, they're downloaded all over the place, they're in ads, and they're always upside down somehow in ads. This is what if you Google normal CT, this is what comes up. And the confluence between advances in computer vision and AI and medical imaging kind of poses these new challenges in terms of patient privacy. So Scott Reeder mentioned the best-selling book that came out detailing the provenance of the HeLa cell line, the scientifically very important HeLa cell line, I will say. After that, the NIH made changes to research protocol that now require explicit consent for the use of any tissue genomic data. And on the other hand, on the other side of the spectrum, EHR data is often structured text data, makes up the bulk of the medical record. It's much easier to aggregate, easier to de-identify. And these sorts of data actually are commonly shared by every single health organization out there, probably, to service providers, partner facilities for things like quality assessment, billing, analytics. And medical images have this funny, peculiar combination of easy transferability on the one hand and highly personal information content on the other. And somehow this is very revealing about weaknesses in our current policies and practices. So we will talk about some of those things. Now, I was charged with speaking about practical issues, which, you know, I want to say is boring but important. So there's so much of it, first of all, so that's a good thing in some ways. It's digitized, which is also a good thing, but then obviously it brings up these issues of privacy and security. And we may have to, it was mentioned that who owns these data? It doesn't even, it changes from where your location is in Europe and in the US and Canada. And as we redefine data ownership, obviously we also have to rethink about data sharing because they sort of go hand in hand. But in terms of the boring but important, You have to identify which cases you want. You have to sort them out. You have to try to de-identify them in an appropriate way. You need some kind of data use agreement. You have to house the data somewhere. You have to harmonize the data coming in from multiple places. We know that from clinical trials. And then hopefully we develop some kind of unified solutions that can cross institutions more easily than we are currently used to. So it sounds like a simple ask, right? And this is based on a real life example of ours. You want to go to the archive, you want to pull 10,000 cases, like head CTs or something, whatever it is. You want to de-identify them and you want to share them. But somehow it's like not so simple, right? Because an MCIT helped me make this slide. What it really looks like is this. And this is when they kind of cleaned up my notes. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but starting from the top, as you collect the images, radiologists know there are all kinds of limitations on rule-based routing, even identifying the last, 10,000 images of a certain type with multiple scanners, different operating systems, different vendors. And machine learning scientists don't really almost believe me when I'm like, oh, no, rule-based routing just sucks. But everyone who's a radiologist can tell you that that's the case. And this is just an example. Is this running? Where, the red column, the red and yellow column, that first column on the left, that shows you, how many names we have in our institution for T1 weighted pulse sequence of the brain. Okay, so it's close to 700 different series descriptions. And I know that's probably extreme and there are many reasons why that maybe should not be the case, but when you actually go through and sort, that's what we were dealing with. So you can see quickly why it breaks down. And why is it important? Well, this is from Jan Fritz, our MSK chief, and his team, and work that actually he started at when he was at Hopkins. But there's a critical need for correct routing, right? Because you have some kind of algorithm, you have a model, it does a bone age prediction, very nice. But if you give it something crazy, it spits out something crazy. And this is a photo, I think, of the Hopkins residents. I was like, oh, they're very precocious. They're only 13 years and 4 months. Of course, this is nonsense. But what's truly problematic is if you put in something that you don't know is inappropriate, but is less obvious that the prediction is nonsense. And then you got to de-identify it. And there are many de-identification tools, but not all of them are good, and there's almost too many that confuse people. So here I've just highlighted a few different things. The RSNA clinical trial processor is highly used. It deals with DICOM metadata. There are other tools that deal with raw data that are endorsed by the ISMRM, and then there are other things like skull stripping and defacing. The other point that actually Freeman and et al. Make in their 2012 publication is that you can't overdo de-identification either. So you actually have to maintain subject level uniqueness, like that these two images are from the same person. You have to retain longitudinal temporal information, that this study came after this study, that this study was 3 months after the first study. You have to maintain an audit trail in case you need to go back and figure out what, in fact, these images, is this correct? And some kind of ability to map back often to the PHI. So the Mayo Clinic published this paper in the New England Journal showing that in 85% of cases, facial recognition software was able to identify their research volunteers based on their MRI. And this is not only possible, it's kind of easy, right? This is used with permission, but this is a program on my colleague's, Android, and it's a program that's intended to visualize 3D printing to visualize through 3D printing, whatever it is, and not for medical imaging. So gone are the days where you need separate workstations like the Vitria or the Leonardo to render 3D medical imaging. The middle image is interpolated, so it's thick slice imaging, 5mm thick slices. So we think, oh, it's only high resolution data sets that have this problem. But in fact, you can interpolate and generate faces from 2D images as well. So I mentioned there are some tactics to avoiding the face, but these have problems as well. Here's an example where does a beautiful job segmenting the brain tumor and the edema, but then if you don't actually pre-process all the data, you don't perform the skull strip, the model performs very poorly. So once you share it, the data need to be harmonized before they can just be dumped together. So wouldn't we all love our data to look like this? In fact, what the data really looked like was this, right? Where there's significant differences in the scanner, and that's much bigger than the effect size of the disease. So it's fairly customary in machine learning to normalize the data before training. You see on the left is test, retest, same scanner, same person. It's completely overlapping. The histograms are completely overlapping. When you scan the same subject on different scanners in the middle, you see that there's some deviation. And then if you normalize it, it looks much better. Here's an example from CT on the left is from NYU, and it shows the histogram distribution of the Hounsfield units. It made sense to me, a spike in the histogram at -1000, all that air around the head, and it's kind of grouped around 0 with fat and soft tissue. But then we tried to take some data from the RSNA data set that were available, and you see that the pixel values vary across these different images that were part of the data set, just showing the importance of normalization. In the final few minutes, I will give a couple of examples from our experience in terms of data sharing, and one is an internal example, and one is, as David mentioned, a wider release. So here we called it Image Core, but we established an institutional resource to help our own investigators retrieve and de-identify imaging data, providing a kind of centralized method so each PI is not dreaming up their own method or calling their own best friend in MCIT to create their own thing. It uses standard de-identification methods, preserves these intra-subject consistencies that we talked about. It is a modified version of the RSNA clinical trial processing tool because there are a few issues, I want to say, or criticisms of that tool. So we tried to improve on that. And it also deals with imaging reports. We engineered a software portal to share within the institution the data sets, as well as if you need to share with outside collaborators. So that was a great success within the institution. Fast MRI, Michael Recht mentioned, it is available to the public, although there is a data use agreement. It's one of the world's largest, if not the world's largest, de-identified set of MR images and raw MRI measurements for public research use. And it's the goal was really to accelerate research in this area. It's hosted on AWS. I mentioned the data use agreement, and it's been broadly accessed. We also released with the data tools that go with it, evaluation criteria, code, and data loaders that can facilitate the use. And in addition to that, there was some challenges and a public leaderboard, again, to encourage this interdisciplinary approach to research. So in summary, this is an era where we're applying computer vision advances to medical imaging, and essentially by sharing data, I think of it as sharing knowledge. So there are broader theoretical issues around the sharing of medical imaging, but there are very practical, boring but important issues as well around the sharing of medical imaging. And I'm looking at this as an opportunity for the scientific community to really define best practices. And this forum is a great opportunity to develop also open source and universal tools and platforms to aid in these tasks. And thanks to the Funko Pop radiology leadership team and my partner in crime, Sumit Chopra, who is our new machine learning director of research, as well as our NIH funding and our whole team.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Louie. That was a great talk. Our final speaker of this session is Dr. Ona Wu, who's the director of the Clinical Computational Neuroimaging Group at the Martinez Center for Biomedical Imaging at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Wu's research focuses on developing advanced data acquisition methods, post-processing techniques, and machine learning algorithms to improve the diagnosis, prognosis, and management of brain-injured patients. The title of Dr. Wu's talk is Emerging Solutions, De-Identification, and Federated Learning. Dr. Wu.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak at this very timely and important symposium. These are my conflicts of interest, though none of them are actually relevant to this talk. Okay, so as we have heard from previous speakers, from yesterday's outstanding AMY symposium, in order for machine learning algorithms to be able to work robustly and produce very accurate results, large amounts of data are necessary. And the amount of data available for radiological applications at any single center is insufficient, and thus sharing of data across hospital centers is critical in order to be able to do robust AI. So traditional approaches for sharing and pooling these data involves each hospital transferring the curated and harmonized data sets as described by Yvonne in the previous talk to typically a central system that has lots of computational power and resources and memory. So the central system typically trains the model to perform whatever task that is desired for the ML algorithm. For example, stroke detection or large vessel occlusion detection using acute imaging data. And then once the model parameters has been trained, the central server can then, which could be like an academic site or one of these third-party commercial companies, can then release or sell the model back to the participating hospitals and even to new hospital organizations. And so before the contributing hospitals can send the data to the central server, there are many challenges involving patient privacies that involve legal and ethical concerns that have been addressed by the previous speakers. So although patients do not necessarily have to further benefit from the secondary use of the data, as data stewards, I think we need to make sure that patients do not suffer harm from the sharing of the data. And so this is the reason why there's a lot of focus in regards to privacy concerns. So there are a lot of technical challenges involving de-identification, which involves more efforts when we're dealing with medical images. And many of these concerns has been addressed in Yvonne's previous talk, so I'll just go over them very quickly here. So one of the biggest problems with shared medical imaging is that is to remove screenshots. So basically within the data format itself, identifying information may actually be burned into the images. And this typically occurs for basically post-processed data sets. And in order for these post-processed data sets to be sure that the data is coming from a specific patient, the patient name or the patient MR record numbers or identification numbers are actually burned into the data itself. And as a result, as part of the de-identification process, algorithms need to be intelligent enough to be able to remove this data while preserving the important information. Alternatively, one can just exclude all images that are secondary screenshots. However, this is at the cost of potentially losing valuable information that's contained in these reformatted data sets. And as Yvonne mentioned before, within these data images, so the basic file format for medical images is called DICOM, and within the DICOM data set, it contains a lot of clinical information. And so this clinical metadata has information such as the patient name, date of birth, sometimes the address of the patient, and the address of the hospital where the exam was performed. And all of this can lead to inadvertent re-identification. And in addition, within the DICOM header, you can see that it actually also has the date of the exam, which again can help lead to re-identification of the patient. So the contributing hospitals needs to make sure that they can remove this data from the DICOM headers. And one can say, well, why even bother removing the headers and perhaps only just share JPEGs of the images? So there's many tools that can convert the raw DICOM data into JPEGs or raw picture formats. Well, it turns out that there's a lot of technical information that's embedded in the DICOM headers that can be useful for post-processing the images that we don't want to lose. So Yvonne has shown several of these tools that allow us to pick and choose which DICOM tags to modify, delete, or keep. However, the end user still needs to decide what kind of approach to use for doing this de-identification. So they can use either a whitelist approach in which they only keep tags which we are sure 100% do not contain any PHI, or you can use a blacklist approach that is delete tags that you are 100% sure contains PHI in order to inadvertently remove important technical information that may be hidden in the DICOM shadow headers. Now, for many medical images, such as chest x-rays, the risk of re-identification of the patient from the medical images are quite low, unless, of course, you actually have some tags that may be in the pictures. However, for neuroimaging, there are unique challenges which Yvonne had addressed in her previous talk. So for example, here, if you go back to our picture of our phantom, you see using very simple open source software packages that's, I basically downloaded with like 2 or 3 button clicks, I can reconstruct the face of the phantom image. And you could say this isn't a very good reconstruction, but as Yvonne has shown previously, there was a study that showed that you can actually re-identify MRI scans with the photo of people with 83% accuracy. And if you say, what are my top 5 guesses, it's actually closer to 95% accurate. So there is a very real risk of re-identification through linkage of these quote unquote de-identified brain MRIs or CT head scans by linkage with public repositories that has identifiable information such as social media sites. And this was all done using publicly available code that does face recognition. So one possible solution that Yvonne had mentioned was to skull strip these patients such that only the brain is preserved as to scramble the faces. However, many medical applications may actually benefit by having facial features preserved, and that may actually be useful for addressing some clinical questions. And lastly, which was discussed by several of the previous speakers, there may also be legal restrictions regarding sharing of patient data without explicit consent from the patients. So given these challenges, how can we accrue enough data in order to build a robust AI algorithm? So one solution that is gaining popularity is to just not share individual patient data at all. As mentioned by the previous speakers, we are not trying to learn data about a specific person, but we're trying to get general knowledge that can be inferred on a group level basis, on a population level. So why not just share model parameters using federated learning? So this is just a basic overview of how federated learning works. So in federated learning, the client, AKA participating hospital, just keeps its individual patient data and trains locally the global model that was initially sent from the central server. So instead of sharing raw data to the central server, the contributing hospital shares updates to the model parameters to the central server. And the central server aggregates these updates and sends the updates back to the contributing hospitals. So here's a little bit more details of how it works. So initially, with this federated learning approach, the client, AKA contributing hospital, does not need to actually share the individual patient data. The hospital basically builds the model, which was initially initialized with a global, say weak model from that was derived from publicly accessible data on the central server. And then when the local site is finished training, in order to further reinforce privacy, they can actually use differential privacy techniques, which by adding noise and clipping to the gradient updates, which will prevent the central server from figuring out exactly which hospital these updates are coming from. And in order to even further improve security, often these updates are encrypted when sent back to the central server. As you can see here. And it should be also noted though, that the central server is actually the one that initiates the request from updates from the contributing sites, and the number of sites and which sites are selected for doing this update is randomly selected by the central server. So once the central server receives the updates from the randomly selected sites, it combines the encrypted results. And at which point, after it has aggregated those results, it sends the updates back to the participating centers. And these updates in itself are actually ephemeral and disappears. And again, to reinforce security. And this cycle repeats, as you can see here in this cartoon, until basically a new set of centers are randomly selected, and until the model converges or a number of pre-specified federated learning rounds has been performed and reached. There are, of course, alternate approaches to the central server federated learning model, which is called a peer-to-peer network. And in this case, each client broadcasts updates to other clients to decide whether it broadcasts its updates to other contributing centers. Now, each of these contributing centers decides whether or not it wants to incorporate these updates. So in this approach, each client/participating center does its own aggregation, and there is, in fact, no need for a central server to orchestrate this whole learning process. So there has been proof of concepts implementations of federated learning in several publications. So it has been used to, and has been shown to produce as accurate results as using the standard traditional learning. So these have been applied to, whole brain segmentation, tumor segmentations, to do fMRI diagnosis of autism spectrum disorders, COVID-19 mortality, and of course, chest ray classification. There are a couple of commercial applications that uses this federated learning approach. So for example, Melody is a collaboration across 10 pharmaceutical companies to identify the most promising drug compounds while protecting intellectual property rights. And then there's also, of course, Gboard, which is an application on Android phones that tries to predict what your next word will be based off, and this is running locally on your smartphone. So in addition to the promises of federated learning, there are, of course, many challenges. For example, the contributing sites may not have sufficient compute or bandwidth resources to train these complex models. And this in turn leads to constraints on the model architecture to keep the number of parameters to a minimum. So one possible solution is for the contributing sites to use cloud-based computing. But of course, this will still require local expertise and regulatory permissions to allow for this training. Another challenge is what's called systems heterogeneity, which can arise from potentially imbalanced data sets across the sites. And furthermore, there will be further heterogeneity, which Yvonne very nicely demonstrated, due to variable equipment, acquisition protocols, as well as quality of the data. There is also the risk of concept drift in that as the different sites are performing the local training, the data distribution may actually change over time. Robustness, of course, is another potential challenge since individual contributing hospital centers may drop out, and thus the model need to be able to perform accurately even if one or two sites are no longer online. And of course, federated learning is also susceptible to attacks like all machine learning methods. And so, potential attack techniques are poison data, poison models, which of course, the more sites of contributing centers that you have, there's more points of weaknesses. There are also other potential inferential attacks. So the whole reason why we're doing federated learning is to protect the privacy of hospitals. But you can do methods where you can figure out, how many classes are at one hospital, the number of cases that are being contributed from a hospital, and the quality of the data being served. And lastly, there's considerations of fairness. So we want the models to be able to perform well for non-majority classes while maintaining privacy. However, in an excellent Amy talk yesterday by Dr. Qasimi, she showed that differential privacy techniques can actually worsen performance. So a potential solution is actually personalized federated learning, where each site basically trains simultaneously a local variant of the global model alongside the global model itself. And these studies have shown that the overall performances were not only improved, but it could achieve both fairness and robustness simultaneously. So in conclusion, despite the challenges that comes with distributed learning, federated learning seems to be a promising solution that can enable scalable and robust AI by allowing for the sharing of large amounts of data while preserving privacy. And last but not least, I'd like to acknowledge all of my collaborators and members of my lab. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Wu. That was really a great set of talks, and I'd like to invite everybody now to come in for the panel discussion and remind everybody watching on the live stream that you can still submit questions in Slido as we do the panel discussion. So I'd like to start with the question that I'm going to address to everybody on the panel, and that is that David in his first talk compared data to water or to oil. And the question is, given the lack of equitable distribution of drinking water, for example, in Flint, Michigan, and many places across the world, how do we ensure the equitable sharing of data to advance medical knowledge for all populations?
Maybe I'll start with that. Is that okay, Michael?
Sure, absolutely.
Great. Well, it's a great question, and thank you. I think it was Audrey who brought that forward. Thank you so much. I think that it's an interesting construct in terms of the equitable access. In some ways, I think the Flint, Michigan case is the exception that proves the rule to a certain extent, in that when we look at the equitable distribution, drinking water, while it's not perfect, at least in the United States, it's about as close as we come to perfect of equitable distribution of anything that we currently have. Internationally and across the world, obviously there are much more, much greater challenges. But the model, in many ways, it's more about the approach to distributing this and making it widely available for the benefit of individuals widely. And when I was in business school, we had a session that was about the class was about comparing water, the availability of water and the availability of diamonds. And the irony is diamonds are useless and water is absolutely critical. And so much more money was made off of diamonds than water. And it's exactly because it's so valuable but that's the reason why it's not allowed to make profit on it. And so that method of distribution, the way that we make it a public good, it's the approach that is really, I think, the thing that has the most promise in making it widely available, and then constantly working to make sure that it remains equitable, just like Audrey is pointing out.
So David, let me follow up if I can. So right now, large institutions like yourself, like NYU, MGH, Wisconsin, we have the ability to do everything we just heard about, de-identify data, send data to industry, do the pipeline. What about all the institutions that are much smaller? I mean, should there be some national effort where all data can be de-identified and shared in a central repository that is then controlled by maybe some governmental agency or the NIH, where people can access the data rather than people coming to Scott and saying, I'd like to share your data, or coming to you to say, we want to share your data? How do we make sure everybody actually can have access to the data, and also we can get data from all the hospitals and really get the diverse populations that we need to make sure that everybody is served by the algorithms we develop?
Great question. There were a number of points that you identified there. I think really what you're getting at is, how do we have appropriate representation of the populations that we're trying to study? And I think that absolutely is and should be, well, it should be a priority of society, and I think government has a strong role to play, including our research enterprises. I'm a little hesitant in terms of a centralized repository, especially as we heard from Yvonne and Ona and Scott, all about the challenges in harmonization of all of those data. Centralization often is, it seems great, but then in practicality, it's really difficult to implement. So I think it's probably more likely that we can and probably we should take, at least for the time being, a more distributed approach to accomplishing that same aim, and just be much more mindful and maybe augment as needed those populations who aren't generally well represented and need to have a greater representation.
If I may add a couple of things. I think it's true, Michael, your question was like packed with multiple points. One piece of it is, it's kind of two things, right? The universal ability to share one's own data from one institution, smaller institutions, out to the greater public or more widely. And I think we will get there, because we're developing the platforms that could be accessible to a greater number of different types of institutions, right? Whether they're public or private or not-for-profit or for-profit, smaller and larger. So, and there are increasingly industry solutions that might be available, that could be, and hopefully open source solutions that could be available for people, so they don't need a whole team of engineers to make something happen. So that's one thing. And the other point you said was the kind of universal access to data. How can we make sure that smaller investigative teams have access to data? And that really is what David mentioned, of these more widely available data sets, and making them not just something that a few institutions can use, but everyone can. And I think it's not just the accessibility of the data, but the sometimes hardware that's required to actually use the data. So even though you have access, you may not be able to even download it when it's so enormous. And we've had questions about our own data set, because the raw data is enormous, and people are like, oh, it crashed my whole thing trying to get it. And so even though it's accessible to them, it's like not very useful. So that's another issue.
Great. Scott, do you want to say something? Were you going to say something?
Sure. I was just going to say, I really liked Ona's overview of the federated learning, and I think that's going to be an important component of that will dovetail into what David was saying. I would just add that perhaps forums like this are really important to help set those ethical frameworks, and then also getting down to data use agreements and sort of maybe some level of standardization as well, so that we know what to expect with these data use agreements so that it really facilitates a generalized approach so that you can do this at multiple sites as well to make it a lot easier. We've seen this before. We know what we have to do. Here are the standards that we have to achieve as part of the sharing.
Right.
And I guess I'll just chip in and say I think federated learning can potentially address many of the problems that you mentioned, Dr. Recht. Of course, not considering all the ethical, legal issues, which I defer to David and the others to handle, because that still needs to be fundamentally addressed. But with federated learning, even for hospitals that are starved of resources, if you can do your analysis using cloud-based systems, so, say, for example, when they want, quote unquote, download the data, they can potentially transfer the data to another cloud server, and hence, the data storage, et cetera, and compute power is not really, that much of a limiting factor anymore. And I would still say there's potentially, they still need to have some expertise, but I think that could also be addressed through the use of open source code. So I know there's a big push to making data public, but I would reverse that and say that there should be perhaps more of a push to make code public and programs accessible and transparent, so people can see exactly how all of these programs are working that's making all of these predictions for people, and ultimately refine it and make even better algorithms. And if the programs are structured well enough, it can actually work transparently on the data that could be stored in a variety of different silos, as opposed to one major repository to rule them all, right?
Great. Let me change topics just for a minute and talk about patient consent and the right to use the data. So it sounds like most people on the panel believe that it should be for the greater good and we don't need patient consent. One of the questions that came from the audience is, has anybody actually talked to patients or patient advocacy groups to see how they feel about this? And is there a way of educating patients so they know their data is being used even if we don't give them a choice? And the second question that had to do, so I'll do both and you can answer either or. Given the Henrietta Lacks story and the fact that the NIH, as Yvonne said, has said you can't use tissue or genomic without consent, why is imaging data differently, especially since we know that some of the data, even if we think we de-identify it, isn't going to be de-identified and might be in the future be able to be re-identified. So again, two questions, I apologize, but anybody for the panel to address either of those related questions.
I can take a stab at it. So there are some practical issues that need to be considered. And one issue about obtaining consent retrospectively is that, for example, patients may not be alive any longer. There's also the practical issue of actually creating more harm by creating consent forms in a paper trail that's actually more likely to create a HIPAA violation, so to speak, by creating that paper trail. So that's sort of a practical issue to consider. We have a long history of doing this with retrospective studies and IRB consent as well. So this is not entirely new from that point of view. But I think it does get a little sticky, of course, when you talk about the re-identification, and it would be really good to understand better, at least from my point of view, how real that risk is. I think maybe MRIs or CT of the big toe is a little bit different than an MRI or a CT of the head, for example, and that's a layer that certainly needs to be woven into that as well.
Yeah, there is a long history of, so this isn't something new. I agree with Scott, and I think I tried to express also that there's this continuum, right, where electronic health record data, you could argue, well, we use electronic health record data and aggregate it and share it all over the place. Like companies are getting that information, right, from every major healthcare system. And your data as a patient with some kind of blood draw is going out with all of that. And so if that's a problem, that's not thought to be a problem. And so, but I agree that medical imaging falls in this funny category that seems like it's in between and therefore reveals some of the inconsistencies, actually. I don't know that we have the answers, but to be honest, with AI, with machine learning advances, some of those electronic health records are potentially, you know, re-identifiable if you really looked over a long course, and except that, you know, nobody has those data, right? Nobody has access to every blood draw that I've ever had, but if they did, they could probably identify me from that as well.
But Michael, can I maybe hit on your two questions? First of all, in terms of whether we've talked to patients, we didn't specifically talk to patients, although we did review the literature, and the answer is, and it's not just patients, it's public, right? People. And the answer, it depends on how you frame the question. For the most part, when it's framed from the perspective of, you know, the information will be protected and it will be used for benefit, there's always a spectrum, of course, but for the most part, there's a majority that feel that it is appropriate for, and they're okay with it, essentially. But there's lots more study that needs to be done, and it needs to match what actually happens. In terms of the, I want to address the issue of Henrietta Lacks. I think it's really important. There's also a similar case, John Moore, which was here in California at UCLA in the 1970s, about the concept of use of individual data for, you know, commercial gain and so forth. We actually addressed this in our paper, and we felt like it's actually a bit of a different, it's similar, but it's a bit of a different case in that these were not aggregated data. These were from individuals, right? And that, even though it may be related, actually it is a bit different, because I think you make a much stronger case when you're aggregating, especially when you're aggregating hundreds and thousands of data and you're looking through the patient, so to speak, at the underlying phenomena. So there are obviously there are issues around, you know, certain ethnic groups and things that have been exploited over the years. So we have to be really careful about that. But in general, it does feel, and I think that this is something that we've found others have agreed with, it feels a bit different when it's one person that then, you know, a tremendous amount of commercialization has happened based on their cell tissue or their imaging data versus thousands of people that a relatively small amount of value was derived.
I'll just add that a point that relates to what Scott was saying, that there are some potential harms. I think later today, there are more talks about consent specifically, but let's say you were to require consent for use of any image, actually there are studies that show that your data are very biased then, and their higher socioeconomic groups opt in to participating, and that there is poor representation of other groups.
And we weren't opposed to consent. I just want to make it very clear. It's not that we're opposed to it. It's just, as Yvonne is alluding to, all of the practical elements that come in. I mean, in many ways, if you now maintain a database of those who have opted in or out, and then have to match that with the the clinical data, you now expose potentially another source of risk, right? So it's just complicated, and what we came to is, as long as we maintain those risks as relatively low, that it's similar to the risk that you have, or it's similar to the construct of when you go into an academic medical center, for example, where it's implied in your care that people will act in an ethical and appropriate way, but also that people will learn from you, and like trainees, for example, will learn from your case as you receive that care.
Just one follow-up question I can ask is, if you're not obtaining informed consent, which it sounds like we're not at a lot of institutions, are you at least informing patients when they come in that their data will be used for this? It's going to be de-identified, so at least they're aware of what's going on. It's not a surprise. Does anybody do that routinely?
That's a great question, and to the best of my knowledge, we are not doing that, but I think that makes a lot of sense, and there's been a lot of discussion at our institution and really around the idea of transparency, and this would be at all levels of care, and I think that's sort of the implicit contract that you have about getting your care at an academic medical institution is that it may be used in a de-identified and an appropriate way. But I think that would be a great area to dig into and to explore, and maybe a good solution to this problem, but we're not routinely doing that.
let me change topics just for a second. And this is a question directed by Soner to Dr. Wu. The question is, why is blockchain or smart contract structure not used for anonymizing and sharing data?
I would have to say I'm by no means an expert on blockchain, so I do not have an answer for that. Maybe Yvonne may be more familiar with blockchain structures.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think we will have to get
Okay.
back to that person.
Yeah, I'll defer to my postdoctoral fellow. And get back to
All right, so I don't understand blockchain either. I was hoping I could learn something there from the question. One more question for you, Dr. Wu, and that is, can you elaborate on why differential privacy approach may lead to the decline in model performance compared to federated learning?
Well, not compared to federated learning. So you would use differential privacy as part of your federated learning. So you would be basically at each local institution, what you would do is you would, what we would call dither your local updates. So basically what you are transmitting to the central server or to other sites is just the delta of your parameters. So it's the gradient of your model parameters. Now, rather than given the actual raw gradient updates, you don't want to basically overfit for your specific institution. And so what you would do is you would add noise to your gradients, and you can also clip it. So this is actually a standard approach that you often use for actually machine learning, where you would do gradient clipping because you don't want any particular data set to basically be, any particular outlier to be driving your model. So similarly in federated learning, you don't want any particular site to potentially drive your model. Now that could be good or bad, right? So it may be that this particular site has a very unique population. Say it's located in an area of like a very low socioeconomic neighborhood. And hence their data is a little bit different than what you would get at one of these, academic centers. And so that's also a challenge in itself, right? Because when you're doing these global models, you're trying to make a global model that works well for everyone. But that, of course, penalizes at how well it works for people at an individual basis. So in order to not have a model that's just trained for you, micro Recht, we make a model that maybe works appropriate for on a population level that represents your population class. However, if you're the majority class, it may not be the same appropriate model as for non-majority class. Just say, standard examples, prediction of heart attacks, very different for men versus women, right? And so if we had a model that was only trained on men, it's going to fail for women. So the way you can potentially treat that is, if say you had only an all male hospital and then all female hospital, you can kind of train it locally using these personalized federated learning techniques, which I think just came out from Virginia Smith's group. She just published a paper in the.
Okay, I've got to get on another call soon, but I'll hold on.
All right.
Hey, Michael, can I just jump in real quick about the concept of federated learning in general? It's fantastic and phenomenal to see that we're seeing this capability come about. I do think we need to recognize it solves one problem, and really elegantly, in that we don't have to move the patient data, but it does potentially pose another challenge, which is what we started off with early on with that Audrey mentioned, that that universal access and democratization of AI, really. When we did the first RSNA challenge, it was Bone Age. It was us and Children's Hospital in Colorado donated this data set and made it available. Within a few weeks, hundreds of people groups had worked on this. Now these challenges have thousands of people. And the winner were a couple of residents from Toronto, and second place was a medical student from Brown. Places you wouldn't have expected at all. So I just think we want to be careful federated learning could potentially lock in the incumbents, so to speak, those who have the resources and the access, and recognize that may be a trade-off if we go that route.
Okay. We're coming to the end. I do want to ask one final question, if I can, to Dr. Reeder. I was jealous as I was listening to your retrospective outcomes research blanket IRB. Is it that once you have that, every study can be done without submitting separate IRBs? Or do you still need separate IRBs under that?
No, it's a single IRB protocol. We originally wrote this in about 2014 with the intention of targeting, the typical chart reviews, that kind of thing. But what we learned very quickly is that we can do retrospective analysis with new software with old data, and so we made sure that the protocol was able to handle that. So the answer is yes, pretty much everything. We can also use all of the metadata around the imaging, except for genomics, which is a whole class in itself. But we want to use lab data. If we want to use demographics and things like that, we're able to collect that. We do have some accountability back to the IRB to report what data we have acquired, and we have that intake form, so we know what's going on. But we're looking at this right now. Our statistics, we've probably been able to access over 1 million patient data sets through this approach. And we have on the order of several hundred projects with it as well. Works great. IRB's happy with it. We're happy with it. And, knock on wood, so far, no glitches. I'd be happy to share it with anyone.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're going to be getting a lot of calls probably from a lot of us.
No problem.
We have that template and make it a lot easier.
No problem. Happy to share.
Well, we should stop because our time is up. This has really been a great discussion. All of you gave great talks and a lot of stimulating discussion, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions. So thank you very much. We're going to be taking a little break now. We're going to be restarting at 9 o'clock Pacific time or noon. And again, thanks everybody for a really wonderful session. All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.